Welcome to Finding Medina, Episode 8, The Battle of Alazán Creek. I'm Brandon Seale. Joaquín de Arredondo was a Spanish nobleman, born to a line of soldiers and administrators that included a governor of Cuba and a viceroy of Buenos Aires. He had begun 1810 as a mere colonel of the Royal Regiment of Veracruz, but the coming revolutionary tumult in Mexico suited his talents well. Over the next 2 years, Arredondo and his Veracruz regiment excelled as Royalist firefighters, quelling uprisings in modern-day Nuevo León, San Luis Potosí, and Tamaulipas, where one wonders if he might have heard of a fiery revolutionary from the Rio Grande named Bernardo Gutiérrez de Lara. Arredondo promised to put to, quote, fire and sword, end quote, all who opposed him, and he was a man of his word. He tortured enemies who fell into his hands, executed prisoners captured in combat, and proved himself to be a ruthless and relentless campaigner. With a patch covering one eye, he even looked the part of an aristocratic rebellion crusher. He was brutal, he was feared, and he was unquestionably effective. When Arredondo heard about the Republican victory at the Battle of Rosillo and the capture of San Antonio, he informed the viceroy that he would personally march north and remedy the situation. That's right, he didn't wait for orders or ask for permission. He just told the viceroy that he was going to go handle it. More accurately, he ignored the viceroy's actual orders to attend to a smaller revolt back in Tamaulipas. But so necessary was Arredondo to the Royalist cause, and so far removed from central authority was his command, that the viceroy could do little more than fume about his disobedience and letters. A new viceroy soon came along, and, recognizing Arredondo's abilities and importance, formally promoted him to the position of Comandante General of Coahuila, Nuevo León, Tamaulipas, and Texas. Effectively, the same position that former Texas Governor Manuel Salcedo's uncle had held. By 1813, then, Arredondo was 43 years old, a virtual second viceroy of northern New Spain, and on his way to Laredo to undertake the reconquest of Texas from the Republican Army of the North. And by the way, if you'd like more information about Arredondo's background and rise to power, I recommend that you read Professor Bradley Folsom's recent biography of the One-Eyed General, which we'll link to on the Rivard Report webpage. In the short term, however, while Arredondo made his preparations and gathered reinforcements, he needed a way to pin down the Republicans and halt their momentum. Despite the distances involved, there was legitimate concern that Gutiérrez de Lara would just keep marching south right down into Mexico. Father Hidalgo had done no less, and in much less time, with an untrained mob just 2 years prior, almost capturing Mexico City, in fact. So Arredondo called on a Royalist colonel, whom we know well by now, the flip-flopping and Father Hidalgo ambushing Ignacio Elizondo. In May of 1813, Colonel Elizondo was in command of 700 men in the field, many of them remnants of the Royalist force defeated at the Battle of Rosillo a few weeks prior, and the rest an assortment of regulars, hailing principally from Chihuahua. General Arredondo ordered Elizondo to march across the Rio Grande, but to halt as soon as he got to the Frio River, where Arredondo's larger army would rendezvous with him in a month or two. The plan was simply for Elizondo to make a show of force, to reconnoiter Republican strength, and to sow a little bit of dissension in the Republican ranks, but not to attack yet. Suspecting, perhaps, that Elizondo might be overeager to redeem his earlier flip-floppery, or aware, perhaps, of his impulsive nature, Arredondo tried to make his order not to attack the Republicans abundantly clear to Elizondo. Arredondo wanted to overwhelm the Republicans, to combine his force with Elizondo's when the time was right, and bring to bear the full brunt of the Crown's vengeance on the Republican army in one great battle. Colonel Elizondo received Arredondo's orders and marched north from Laredo sometime in mid-May of 1813. Republican scouts and their Comanche allies under the command of a chief known as Prieto followed his advance all along the way. Elizondo's force wasn't large, they soon realized, only half the size of the 1,500 or so Republicans in San Antonio at the time. But 700 trained Spanish regulars with 6 pieces of artillery was nothing to sneeze at. And the Republican Army of the North, by comparison, was in disarray. The only thing that seemed to unite them, according to one volunteer's memoir, was their belief that discipline was unnecessary. They had grown cocky, it seems, after having defeated the Royalists so resoundingly at Nacogdoches, Goliad, and Rosillo. And now, several months of inactivity had not only sapped their discipline, it had left plenty of time for infighting. The commanding general who had led the Republicans to victories in those battles, Bernardo Gutiérrez de Lara, had been sidelined after the execution of a dozen or so Spanish officers. In his place, an American who had distinguished himself by winning a mounted duel before the Battle of Rosillo, Colonel Reuben Ross, had been elevated to commander-in-chief. Yet suspicion ran high among the different ethnic factions composing the Republican Army, and it was an open question whether they would even take the field together once the Royalist enemy arrived. On or around June 1st, 1813, Colonel Elizondo brought it all to a head by crossing the Frio River, in direct violation of Arredondo's orders. As Arredondo had feared, Elizondo was intent, it seemed, on blotting out the stain of his earlier flirtation with revolution by becoming the man to have twice crushed Father Hidalgo's revolt, once at Acatita de Bajan in Coahuila, and now in San Antonio. The boldness of Elizondo's advance certainly had an effect on the surprised Republicans. Colonel Reuben Ross became suddenly overwhelmed by the conviction that the Tejanos in his ranks would conspire against him and turn over the Americans to the approaching Royalists. And so when he was informed that Colonel Elizondo had pulled to within a few days' march of San Antonio, Colonel Ross decided that discretion was the better part of valor and beat a hasty retreat to Louisiana, leaving the Republican Army now without even a nominal commander-in-chief. In reality, Colonel Ross had read the situation entirely wrong. Elizondo wasn't interested in the American volunteers. At one point, he had even intrigued with U.S. agents in Louisiana to align himself with American interests, and he consistently seemed to show Americans small courtesies of war throughout the campaign that he would have never even considered offering the Tejanos. This was because Elizondo was actually far more interested in exacting revenge on the Tejano leadership, namely Bernardo Gutiérrez de Lara, Miguel Menchaca, and Antonio Delgado. And rightly so. It was Gutiérrez de Lara who had resurrected Father Hidalgo's revolt in the north of Mexico. It was Miguel Menchaca's devotion to the cause that held together the bickering Tejano and American factions following the demotion of Gutiérrez de Lara. And it was Antonio Delgado's fanaticism that had led to the execution of Elizondo's Royalist compatriots, including his co-conspirator in the ambush of Father Hidalgo, Governor Manuel Salcedo. And so, Elizondo concocted a plan to try to turn the Americans against their Tejano companions. As he set up camp on June 12, 1813, along Alazán Creek in the middle of modern San Antonio's near west side, Elizondo sent secret messengers to the American volunteers with a simple proposition. The Americans could return in safety to the United States, he said, unmolested, with their arms and all their belongings. Everyone would just forget that they had had any role in this little revolution thing. And all they had to do was turn on their Tejano brethren and hand over Gutiérrez de Lara, Miguel Menchaca, Antonio Delgado, and the rest of the local leadership of the Republican Army of the North. In early 1968, a skull emerged from the bar ditch running alongside Blue Wing Road, just 3 miles north of my lovely little hay farm and just a quarter mile east of South Flores Road, one of the old Laredo roads, you might recall. Ann Fox with the Whitty Museum was called in to lead the excavation. Careful digging soon revealed a fairly complete skeleton, as well as 7 copper buttons, a few fragments of cloth and pottery, and a 4-ounce, 1.18-inch diameter lead ball lodged in the skeleton's neck. The Blue Wing body and associated artifacts today reside at UTSA's Center for Archaeological Research, CAR for short, you may recall, as this is also where the late Battle of Medina road mapper Bruce Moses worked. His colleague, Cindy Munoz, has studied the Blue Wing artifacts at length, and so Zach Overfield from our Battle of Medina research team set up an appointment for us to go meet with her. On the day of our meeting, Cindy laid out the box containing the artifacts from the so-called Blue Wing burial on a table in the back of Carr's warehouse. The box contained maybe 24 little Ziploc baggies, most of them full of the old, decaying bones of what appeared to be a pretty complete human body. The lower jawbone, with its perfect complement of teeth, really jumped out at me for some reason. I picked it up and did my best poor Yorick, trying to picture the man whose jaw I now held. We knew that he was a young man, Cindy told us, based on the pelvic and skull shapes. His teeth, spine, and pubic bones suggested that he was in his 20s and stood about 5 foot 8 inches tall. A healed fracture on the underside of his forearm was a classic indicator of a self-defense injury, suggesting that this particular individual was no stranger to violence, even before that 1.18-inch lead ball entered his neck. The lead ball in the poor fellow's neck is actually even more interesting than it sounds. 1.18-inch caliber balls weren't fired from rifles, then or now. A round that large would have only been fired from a cannon. More specifically, this appeared to be a piece of grape or canister shot. 1 inch or so diameter balls which would have been packed by the dozens into a single canister and set off, turning each cannon into a giant shotgun. And importantly, people don't get shot with cannons all that often, even in a town with as violent of an early history as San Antonio's. A body found with canister shot lodged inside of it is almost certainly a war casualty, rather than just a victim of everyday violence. The 7 copper buttons were also more interesting than they first appeared. Buttons, I learned from Cindy, are almost as close to a date stamp as you can get in archaeology. Their composition, style, and method of manufacture can generally be dated with a fair degree of accuracy to within a few decades. These buttons in particular were actually brass, made with a plain, flat crown and back, with wedge-shaped button eyes drilled after they were cast, in accordance with the manufacturing styles of the period between about 1750 and 1812, the years immediately preceding the Battle of Medina. So looking down before me there at the Blue Wing burial and artifacts, taking it all in, a strange feeling flooded over me. Slowly at first, but then more powerfully. It was the slow and steady realization that after so much research, digging, and pleading, at long last here was something tangible from our much-studied battle. And not just something, someone. We were looking at a person, a presumed participant in the battle. This young man had probably marched out of San Antonio with the rest of the Republicans, hopeful, inspired, sure of victory. He had perhaps sat in ambush behind a low row of brush, nervously awaiting the appearance of the first Royalist forces. He had pursued the Royalists through miles of the Encinal's blackjack sugar sand, hot, thirsty, and fatigued. And he had been there for that terrible moment when he and his companions realized that they had stumbled into a Royalist trap. Yes, of course, we couldn't technically be 100% sure, but the remains of a 20-something-year-old man wearing 7 brass buttons from the early 1800s with a lead cannonball in his neck on the most likely road to and from the Medina battlefield sure seemed pretty suggestive of a casualty from the Battle of Medina. And yet, rather than feeling any sort of joy or fulfillment, as Cindy boxed up the artifacts and took them away, I mostly felt an increased sense of frustration. The Blue Wing body proved that artifacts could and did exist into the present. So where were the rest of the artifacts from the battle itself? The artifacts that everyone living in the area claimed they had seen, and yet which no one could seem to lay hands on. I had asked local resident Kathy Brown one time why she thought these artifacts had proven so difficult to lay hands on. Do you remember Kathy Brown from episode 3? You may remember that she's a lifelong resident of Old Pleasanton Road. But what I really hope you remember was that she was the inventor of chocolate tamales, which again you can and should order at www.chocolatetamales.net. In one of my first conversations with Kathy, she had alluded rather tantalizingly to perhaps knowing where some artifacts in the area were located. But she had warned me that locals were leery of revealing too much about the old treasures that they had in the backs of closets and in cigar boxes passed down from Grandma. Leery lest unscrupulous scavengers, metal detectorists, or government agents should show up and try and take them away. I actually understand where these people are coming from. I wouldn't want that to happen either. And I explained that to Kathy, that in reality, the artifacts were less interesting to our research team than knowing where the artifacts were found. If we knew where they'd been found, we could plot them on a map, and taken together, that might provide some vital evidence about these armies' movements. And it might even reveal where they ultimately collided. One day, out of the blue, Kathy Brown sent me a text message. It was short and cryptic, just 2 lines. Time for us to meet? You say when. Absolutely, I responded. I refused to let myself read too much into her text, and I didn't want to scare her off by reacting too strongly at that moment. So I resisted the temptation to ask what she wanted to meet about, and simply proposed a date and time. Perfect, she responded. You will enjoy. When Royalist Colonel Ignacio Elizondo offered the American volunteers of the Republican Army of the North free passage out of Texas in exchange for betraying their Tejano companions, it wasn't the first time that Royalists had tried to turn Republicans against each other. During the siege of Goliad, Royalists had made a similar offer to the Americans. Surrounded and seemingly cut off from reinforcements, the American commander at the time, Augustus McGee, may have been inclined to accept the offer, but the rest of his men refused. When the tables turned and the Republicans later routed the Royalists at the Battle of Rosillo, the Royalist officers tried to surrender to the American officers in an attempt to minimize Tejano's role in a revolt that they had started. Once again, however, the Americans dismissed the gesture and directed the surrendering Spaniards to the army's commander-in-chief, Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara. In June of 1813, however, Gutierrez de Lara was at a new low. He was still theoretically the governor and president of the newly declared Free State of Texas. But following the execution of the Royalist officers and the launch of a smear campaign against him from a jealous rival in Louisiana, he had lost the confidence of many of his American volunteers. He had subsequently been removed from overall command of the Republican Army in favor of American Colonel Reuben Ross. Then, when Colonel Ross fled at the beginning of June, it left the Republican Army leaderless, just as Colonel Elizondo set up camp on Alazán Creek. With the Royalists now gathered at their doorstep, the Republicans in San Antonio convened a council of war. Being that this was a volunteer citizen army, it should come as no surprise that most of the men in the army were in attendance. There's something remarkable to this fact as well, that even in the presence of the enemy, and on the heels of months of infighting, the factions of the Republican Army were able to convene and consider their options in an open, democratic fashion. The acting commander of the American Volunteers, one Major Henry Perry, opened the council by holding up the message that he had received from Elizondo. He revealed its contents to those gathered around, namely, that Elizondo had guaranteed the Americans their lives in exchange for handing over their Tejano companions. Quote, "What says el Señor Gutierrez de Lara? Has he any suggestions to offer?" End quote, Major Perry asked him. Major Perry was clearly testing Gutierrez de Lara. Would Gutierrez de Lara demean himself by begging the Americans to stay? Or would he welcome the opportunity to get rid of the Americans and thus recover command of the army he had raised? Fundamentally, what was more important to him? Command and control over the army, or the cause for which it was fighting? In the face of the test, Gutierrez de Lara refused to panic, and he refused to beg. He rose and appealed to the assembled veterans now, not as their former commander, but as their comrade in arms, he said. His leadership of the Republican Army, after all, had never come from a commission or a king, or even from the dead hand of Father Hidalgo. It had come from his commitment to the cause of independence and the valor he had so unfailingly demonstrated in leading it. Despite the current sad state of relations within the Republican Army, Gutierrez de Lara continued, and the suspicion that the different contingents of that army seemed to hold toward each other at that moment, he had not forgotten what they, Tejanos, Native Americans, and Anglo-Americans, had suffered together, and what they had won together. If their enemies were trying to divide the Republicans now, it was because they feared what the men fighting beneath the green banner might be capable of united together. No. He could not, would not believe that such an insulting offer from such a known scoundrel as Elizondo would sway the noble and gallant Americans against their Tejano brothers, Gutierrez de Lara concluded, putting it back on Perry and the American volunteers. Unbeknownst to Gutierrez de Lara, Major Perry had actually already responded to Elizondo, rejecting his offer. Carlos Beltran tells us what happened next. Quote, when Gutierrez had finished speaking, Perry read aloud the reply that he had sent to Elizondo, and for a moment there was deep silence. The men stood in a line as if transfixed. Then, fully realizing the import of their brave commander's courage, a cheer burst forth, such as had perhaps never been heard in the old town of Béjar. Gutierrez seized Perry's hand and said, "We are more than ever convinced of the magnanimity and bravery of the American soldier, and in order to give you further proof of our loyalty, courage, and fidelity, we only ask that you allow us to lead the van in the coming battle." End quote. The two commanders, indeed, the two ethnic factions, had tested each other, only to be reminded of the other's courage and of the spirit that had originally brought them together. Gutierrez de Lara's request to lead the vanguard was granted. The Republicans then integrated their units, mixing Tejanos, Native Americans, and Anglo-Americans in order to improve unit cohesion, a particularly savvy move given the recent months of tension. On the wings, in command of the mounted units, Gutierrez de Lara placed Lieutenant Colonel Miguel Menchaca, who had by this time become Gutierrez de Lara's most reliable ally. Menchaca had played a critical role as a mediator between the Tejanos and Americans in the previous months, and probably helped pave the way for Gutierrez de Lara's return to favor. Menchaca had almost certainly also played a crucial role in winning over many of Gutierrez de Lara's Native American allies, who had learned over the previous century of fighting, trading, and dealing with Menchacas to respect that name. You can go back to Season 1 of this series to learn more about the special relationship that the Menchacas developed with the Apaches in particular, dating back to the 1690s. And now, the Apaches, Tonkawas, and Comanches allied to the Republicans excitedly took up positions to the rear of Elizondo's camp, delighted at their orders to stampede Elizondo's horse herd and to cut off any potential retreat. Early on the morning of June 20th, 1813, Gutierrez de Lara, along with Captain Antonio Delgado, led their mixed infantry units into position, creeping to within 200 yards of Elizondo's unsuspecting soldiers. Elizondo had camped on the banks of Alazán Creek, in a neighborhood whose street names today honor the men sneaking up on him that morning: Menchaca, Delgado, Ruiz. The Royalist awoke and gathered for morning mass. Just a mile or so away, they could see irrigated fields along San Pedro Creek transitioning into the smaller town plots of San Fernando de Béjar, San Antonio's city center. Colonel Elizondo apparently thought very little of the threat posed by the nearby Republicans. When he had pitched his camp, he neither posted pickets nor sent out scouts. Perhaps he thought the town's surrender was imminent, that the Americans would take his offer, or that the Republican army would dissolve before he could even get to it, and that he, Elizondo, that very morning might be marching into San Antonio as the great hero of New Spain, the man who had captured Father Hidalgo, and the man who had crushed his revolt once and for all in the San Antonio River Basin. Then, the whistle of canister shot broke the stillness of the morning, followed by the reports of the cannons that had fired them. As the first Royalist casualties fell to the ground, Republican riflemen appeared on the edges of camp and began to pick off the confused Royalist congregants who scrambled for their arms and tried to form up their lines. Their discipline served them well. Soon, they were pushing back against the Republicans, using the favorable geography of the creek bed and the small rise on which they had camped to their advantage. The Republican infantry first pressed hard on the Royalist right, which yielded ground only begrudgingly. Hand-to-hand combat soon ensued for several hours. Then, the Republican attack began to stall out. For all of his flip-floppery, we shouldn't underestimate Elizondo's talents as a commander. His training took over, and he immediately began to look for ways to recapture the momentum of the battle. He sent a detachment of troops wide south to try to flank the Republican left. The Republicans noticed the movement, however, and shifted to face it. Gutierrez de Lara and Menchaca then noticed that Elizondo's maneuver had created a vulnerability on his now weaker left, where an artillery position had just been knocked out of commission by Republican cannons. The Republican commanders rallied their mounted forces and charged now the Royalist left, which pulled back under the pressure and began to crumble. Some units on Elizondo's right tried to hold out and dug into their positions, but soon saw their comrades on the left wavering. The Royalist line broke. The soldiers began to flee. When they fled, however, they fled right into the blood-curdling cries of the Republicans' Native American allies. It must have been a terrible slaughter. Perhaps as many as 300 Royalists were killed at the Battle of Alazán Creek, almost half of the fighting force, and another 150 captured, compared to a few dozen casualties for the Republicans. Only a couple hundred Spanish Royalists escaped, including Colonel Elizondo, although he had 2 horses shot out from under him during his flight. What was more important, however, was what he left behind. Almost 2,000 horses and mules, 4,000 pounds of flour, 350 muskets, 2 cannons, 5,000 pounds of gunpowder, and some $35,000 in other goods and coin, critical supplies that made the Republican Army of the North stronger than ever. It was Gutierrez de Lara's finest hour. He was now Don Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara, invicto, undefeated. Yet the rumblings of discontent from across the Sabine were growing louder. There were rumors that the dashing young Spaniard who had so impressed Gutierrez de Lara in Philadelphia, whom Gutierrez de Lara had considered a faithful ally rallying resources to his cause, was conspiring against him. That dashing young Spaniard, José Álvarez de Toledo, had done everything in his power to aggravate the dissension in the Republican ranks following the execution of Governor Salcedo and the other Spanish officers. And now, allegedly, Toledo boasted commissions from both the U.S. government and a provisional Congress in central Mexico, recognizing him as the legitimate commander-in-chief of the Republican Army of the North. Gutierrez de Lara understood the power of propaganda. It's how he had begun his career as a revolutionary. And so he must have sensed that despite his success on the battlefield, he was losing the war of words. He dispatched loyalists back to Louisiana, including perhaps the ever-reliable James Gaines. To halt the flow of Toledo partisans into the province, and to counter their smear campaign with his own PR. But it may have been too late. On the next Finding Medina. Thank you for listening. Make sure to check out the webpage associated with this podcast on the Rivard Report at rivardreport.com. And please, leave your comments or questions for the community to see what new information we can bring out into the light about the Battle of Medina, especially if you have information that we don't. Also, go to iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe and leave us a review, because if everyone who listened to this series left a review, it would launch these important historical events to the top of the charts. Editing for this episode was performed by Susana Canseco, sound engineering by Stephen Bennett. A special thanks to my friend George Gaitan for letting us use his music on this series. You can find out more about him at georgegaitan.tripod.com. Thanks to my SWCA research buddies, Crystal Allgood, Rob Lakowitz, and Zachary Overfield, as well as to former San Antonio City archaeologist Kay Hines. Thanks to Brian Stauffer, our unofficial Old Spanish document transcriber, to Samantha Alanis, our cartographer-in-chief, to Cesar Gutierrez, our unofficial Archivo General de la Nación researcher, and to UTSA's Dean of Libraries, Dean Hendricks, our all-other document finder. And for more information about our podcast and other projects, check out www.brandonseale.com.